I'm Seth, and welcome to Thrift Store Tech. You know, it doesn't matter if you use PC, Mac, or Linux, chances are you know what Windows is. And love it or hate it, Microsoft Windows has been around for a long time. In fact, it's coming up on its 40th birthday in 2025. Wow, hard to think I'm older than Windows. But personally, my first experience was Windows 3.0, which I found complete in box at, can you guess? That's right, a thrift store back in the early 1990s. My parents had a 486 computer that ran DOS that I loved to play games on, but I knew that installing Windows, even an outdated version for the time, would just open up so many more possibilities. And I'll be honest, I've been largely a Windows user ever since, going through nearly every version since that beginning and still using Windows 10 today. Now, of course, Windows 11 is the latest iteration, and 12 is rumored to be on the way this year, but just for today, let's forget all about the recent versions, let's forget about modern systems with gigabytes worth of RAM and solid-state drives, and instead go all the way back and visit Windows 2.03, released in December of 1987. Now, it might be hard to imagine, but this early version of Windows can run on our old friend the Bondwell B200. Now, keep in mind, this is a 1990 laptop, I say that kind of laughingly, with an Intel 80C88 processor at 8 MHz, only 640 kilobytes of RAM, and no hard drive. That's right, we're going to run Windows completely from just two 720 kilobyte floppy disks. Let's have a look at what things have changed and what's remained almost the same. Let's go to the desk.
Okay, we're going to start by booting up to the standard DOS prompt with the DOS startup disk in the A drive. I've already done that here. Next thing to do will be to put the Windows 2 startup disk into the A drive and the Windows 2 system utilities disk into the B drive. And while that's happening, I just want to note that Windows required to boot from DOS up until Windows XP was the first time it was done independently. Before that, you had to load from DOS, or at least put it as an automatic start. So starting up Windows here with the command Win, we get our first screen. I'm sparing you the total boot up time here, because the total boot up time was about 51 seconds. But once it's completely booted, we are into the MS-DOS executive shell. This will show us what's on each disk, A and B. And just to start us off on the B disk, let's take a look at Balloon. Now this was an odd little program called DaVinci Balloons. I'd never heard of it before this version of Windows, and on a monochrome monitor, I guess it's pretty pointless. But you should be able to see different colors of those balloons as they move up. Not too exciting on a monochrome monitor, I know. And that's about enough of that. Let's click on our top left corner to close. And of course, this being a disk-based system, it takes a moment to get back there. Let's check out calc.exe. Yeah, this time I'm not sparing you all the load time. But this is calculator, of course. Everyone knows the calculator function in Windows. And this one is one that was improved over the years, of course, because now we have scientific functions and such. In this model, it's just really a simple calculator. And if I were to go up and click on Edit and About, I would get the About information that this is from 1987 by Microsoft, as well as a couple of keyboard shortcuts. So clicking out of that and moving up to our upper left corner again, go ahead and close that one out, and let's see what else is on the list. Next we have clock.exe, and loading that one up is exactly what it says on the tin. It is a clock. And you might be wondering about a digital clock. That's actually going to be a little later on disk A. That's not the correct time that I filmed this. Of course, I just hit the default value of midnight on January 1st, 1980 for the DOS disk. But that's about all there is to clock. It's a clock. Nothing too terribly exciting. So closing that out. Next couple of files are fonts, so we're not going to be able to really do anything with those. MS-DOS would take us to the DOS prompt. Notepad. Here's the one feature that I found to be essentially the same throughout this version of Windows all the way up to at least Windows 10. I haven't seen Windows 11 personally. But it is just your simple word processor notepad. So typing in there, this is a test of Notepad. Yeah, I am a horrible typist, in case you didn't know. In my defense, sometimes the keys on this keyboard stick a bit, but this is a test of Notepad. And as I was saying, Notepad's largely gone unchanged, and I will spare you the horrendous typing that I did, as well as the corrections. I have a Mavis Beacon typing tutor program that does work on this computer. Maybe I should start using it. But apart from that, just to save the file, I'm just going to save it to the B disk as test. And this means I should be able to open it up right back into Notepad as I've done here. About the only other thing is that if we go to the edit menu, we can choose word wrap, and it will wrap our words just like normal Notepad does, or modern Notepad does. This just takes a lot longer to do it. So going down there, let's just save our changes. We really take for granted how fast Word and Notepad are nowadays. I'm a little surprised it didn't ask if I wanted to overwrite the current file. But closing out with our top left button again, let's go back over to our menu. And I don't see test on here just yet. This isn't updating in real time. So instead, we're going to jump over to the A drive and then back to the B drive. And once we get back to the B drive, there's our document, test.txt. I think I called it a doc before, but it's text. And opening up that file, ever so slowly in real time because we are running from floppy disks, there's our document. It did not save the word wrap, but there's our document. So let's close out of there and let's check out our next program, which our next one is going to be the ever classic Microsoft Paint, which has gone through some iterations and of course some updates and some changes. And again, it's not going to look very impressive on a monochrome monitor, but here's our early version of Paint from about probably somewhere between 1987 and 1989. And as you can see, this is one that's taking a while to load. I started to wonder if it was frozen for a second, but nope, here we are in Paint. So let's mess around with Paint a little bit. And again, I'll spare you just how slow this is. This is sped up to about 300% speed, but I was just basically messing around with the tools in here, seeing what could be done with what, very much like I did as a kid back then. And apparently I drew a butt because I'm so mature. So let's go out there. We're not going to bother saving this. We're just going to exit. And once we're out of Paint, oh, it actually will ask us if we want to save the changes. And I'm just going to say no. But back to the MS-DOS Executive. Reversi, which I had no idea what this was when I clicked on it. And I was a bit surprised to see that it was a game I know as Othello. So let's give this game a try. Already I'm forgetting I can only move a certain space. And I'm not going to subject you to the whole game. Suffice to say, I am really bad at this game. The times that my wife and I have played it as a board game, she routinely kicks my butt at it. So I've got absolutely nothing to brag about here. So moving on from Reversi, again, we've got a couple of font files. There is a spooler.exe program that would actually be for connecting a printer through the serial or the parallel port. Of course, there's no printers connected to this computer, so that's just nothing. Taipei, I clicked on, again, had no real idea what it was, but I was pleasantly surprised when it finally opened, which is taking its time because it's actually a pretty complex program to open and load. And again, I'm going to spare you the whole wait time. This footage is sped up about 300%. But once it did load, I was pleasantly surprised to see what I refer to as Mahjong, which I used to love playing as a DOS shareware game. And looking at this, I feel like I could play it on this monitor, but I feel like I'd have a much harder time because it is monochrome and I'm used to seeing these tiles in color. And I feel like just making it monochrome would be even more of a challenge. And again, speeding up this footage, of course, I think this is about 400% or 450% speed up, just because it was getting a bit dull. And minimizing it makes it even harder to see those tiles. So let's just minimize that, drop it into the background. Again, waiting for this to come back, and there's nothing really left to see on disk B from a couple of .ini programs. So let's jump over to the A drive instead. We see balloon is still the same. So taking a look at our next one for check.e.exe, and again sped up to about 700 or 800 times the original speed just to keep things interesting. But Checkers is a game I used to love playing on a DOS freeware version. I had a lot of fun with it, but I haven't played in forever, and as a result I am now awful at it. But going back and closing that, we'll go back to the executive shell and go on down to our next program, DigiClock. As I mentioned when we saw on the B drive, the clock program, DigiClock is pretty much what we're used to today. It just runs the time down in the corner. Again, this wasn't the correct time, but it still showed the time down in the corner, which is something that really hasn't changed much in modern Windows. It is still down there. Now the next program, flasher.exe, my first thought was, oh my gosh, what is that? And I have to give a warning to anyone who's photosensitive about this program. This literally just flashes your screen black and white. And right now, of course, it's not too bad, but as we go in there to setup, we can choose color, black, white, full screen, speed. Speed is where things start to get interesting. So I sped this footage up, but basically I picked a random number and you can see how fast that's flashing. Pretty obvious reason for Microsoft to get rid of that program. I don't want to know how many people were affected by that. So clicking on the Hanoi.exe file takes us into the Towers of Hanoi game. It's a strategy game that I can never quite figure out. If you're not familiar with it, you're given a set number of discs, and the object is to get all the discs from that first peg to the last peg in their size order, while only moving one piece at a time. And while I was looking at it, I kept thinking that it was a game that you could play and click through. It made sense to me. And it wasn't until a bit later that I figured out that this isn't an actual playable game, it's more of a solution for the game. As you can see, it just demonstrated out how to solve it with just 3 discs. So closing out of that and going back to the MS-DOS file listing, the next one was satellite.exe, which had no idea what to expect from this one. And when it came up, again, I really didn't know what was going on. So I clicked on the About, and I don't know if this was actually a piece of the original release of this or if this was just added on to the image, but apparently this was a piece of shareware created in 1989. The original author was asking for comments and or $10 contribution. And I put a box over it because he did actually include his address in here, and I'm not going to dox a guy from 30-something years ago. And just out of curiosity, I did look up what that would be equivalent to today, and as you can see from the screenshot from the inflation calculator by the U.S. Labor Bureau and Statistics, that it would be equal to about $25.47 today. So moving on, I do have to say this was one of the more interesting programs that I checked out, and I have sped up the footage here a bit. But apparently it was a tool to help cable satellite users find the right satellite with their satellite dish back in the day. Clicking begin let you choose a state and a town. You choose whatever was closest to you, and then you could scroll through different satellites and see what was on them. I did see a number of different channels, some of which are still around today, like Nickelodeon and the Playboy channel. That one did make me laugh. But based on the state and city that you choose, it would show you the approximate azimuth and elevation of the satellites responsible for your area and what channels each satellite was responsible for. And there were some that had quite a few open slots. And while I'm sure this information is no longer accurate today, it still made for an interesting look at what probably was a pretty useful program back in the late 80s, early 90s. So moving right on to quit out of there, I saw this next one, Starbase. Again, no idea exactly what it was, but when it loaded up, I realized that it was a clone of Missile Command, which is a game that I actually like and am half decent at if I have a trackball. This was a lot tougher with the touchpad that I've been using for this Windows experience, and again, like with most games on here, you can see I'm doing quite badly, but I can see this being a very fun time waster back when this was new. And as I went on, I tried to make it full screen, and unfortunately this completely froze the game. I was able to keep moving my mouse cursor, but I could not click on anything, and I ultimately wound up having to completely reboot. Now, upon getting back in and getting back to where I was, I clicked on this one, Superfuse. Again, no idea what it was going to be. And it wound up being this funny little program that just draws different shapes and different lines and patterns. Actually reminds me a lot of the visualizer in Windows Media Player, especially the one from the XP days. And I really wish I had a color monitor to actually see this on instead of the monochrome. Ultimately, going full screen with this did cause the whole system to freeze and crash, and I did end up having to reboot yet again, unfortunately. And oftentimes that was the situation with these older computers, that something would just freeze up and you'd have no choice but to cut power and start over. So coming back in, I tried this one, sysgraph.exe, which, again, I wasn't quite sure what was happening at first until I realized that it's a system monitor. Down there in the left-hand corner, you can see it drawing out a very small graph. And I'm not 100% sure, but I believe this is monitoring how much system resources and memory are being used. Of course, only having 640 kilobytes of memory means it's spiked out pretty often. And of course, we still have our system resource monitors today. They're just a lot more detailed and a lot more informative. So closing out of sysgraph and going back to the MS-DOS executive shell, I realized that there wasn't really a whole lot left to try except for opening up the sysgraph.txt file, hoping it would give me some more information about the sysgraph program, and it did, but it was rather lengthy and honestly not all that exciting. So being out of programs to really look at, I started to think about, well, what's stayed the same, what's changed, what's gone? And really the only thing that's stayed the same from this version to current day is Notepad. The other programs that have improved or have been changed were Superfusion with that drawing program, and actually that's kind of largely gone now that you think about it. It's really only for the visualizers. System Graph has been improved, Calculator has been improved, Clock has been improved, Paint has been improved, of course. And as for gone, just flat out taken away, Balloons, a flasher for very obvious reasons. Of course, Satellite being largely outdated and not even really very useful anymore, I don't believe. I'm not sure how many people are still using satellite dishes for their cable. And lastly, the game options that there were. I was a little surprised that there was no version of Solitaire in this version of Windows, actually. But of course, the generic Missile Command was gone. Othello, Mahjong, Towers of Hanoi. Of course, these are all programs that you can get yourself now and install into Windows as their own standalone programs. They don't need to be part of Windows anymore. But it's interesting to see how many of those programs just disappeared over time. And of course, with nothing really left to check out, the only thing left to do is to exit out of Windows, which this will end your Windows session and drop us back to the DOS prompt once I put in that DOS disk, and to shut down the monitor and get that little satisfying blip from a CRT turning off. And now I do want to specify, even though I've been talking about running Windows from those two 720 kilobyte floppies, when I did download the image file for Windows 2.03, it did spread out across actually 5 720 kilobyte floppies. And disk 1 was the one that had the installation program that would allow you to spread it out across 5¼ inch floppies or 3½ inch floppies, or even install to a hard disk. If there's any interest in that, I might just make a video showing that process. Please let me know in the comments if it's something you would like to see.
I hope you've enjoyed this trip back through time to visit this older version of Windows and see just how much has changed and how little has stayed the same, really. By the way, if you watched my other video about the Bondwell playing DOS games, you might remember hearing the sound effects of those games. And if you're wondering why I had no sound for the games in this video, well, it's because this was the only sound involved. The only programs in Windows 2 that even had that sound that I could hear through the Bondwell speaker were error beeps for Taipei and the disk selection for the Towers of Hanoi. And I'm not sure if that's due to there not being a sound card in the Bondwell, but either way there just wasn't that much to hear. If you have any memories or stories of older Windows versions, I'd love to hear about them in the comments below. And of course, I'm always interested in hearing about your own thrift store tech finds. They're out there, waiting to be found with luck and persistence. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to like, subscribe, and comment as it really helps the channel to grow. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time.